This video is the text set creation number 1, Israel and New Historicism. This project is for text and context course, examining world Englishes through literature, presented by Laura Franco, Jessica Lara, and Nicolle Palacio.
We have selected Israel by Junot Diaz as our primary text to be analyzed through New Historicism. We believe this story shares similarities with other texts analyzed over the course. This story is interesting not only because of the possible connections to other texts, but also because of its deepness, as it will be shown later. We selected 3 other texts to enrich the analysis of Israel: The Brief Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde, Civil Peace, and Indian Education. These 4 stories have similar themes. For example, it is very important to know about each of the author's background. These stories also give a description of particular sociocultural conditions and traditions of certain groups. In fact, those groups are peripheral societies. They also share similarities related to the world Englishes. There are some common linguistic features of English varieties. Thanks to the previous features, sometimes POV is set up to boost the deepness of these stories.
There are several elements in some stories written by Junot Diaz, such as Israel and The Brief Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde, that allow us to identify them as mirror of Junot's life. To begin the analysis of these stories, first we are going to recognize the most important elements in the context of the author. Second, we are going to analyze the features that these 2 stories share and how through these elements we could recognize the Junot's life. Junot Diaz is a Dominican-American writer that was born in 1968 in Dominican Republic, and he was the 3rd child in a family of 5. The first years of his childhood, Junot lived with his mother and his grandparents while his father was working in the United States. Then, when he was 6 years old, his family moved to New Jersey, and when Junot was 8 years old, he was raped. Related Junot's personal experience, some of the characteristics presented in the histories and that share Israel and the wondrous life of Oscar Wilde are: first, both describe the experiences of Dominican boys, Junior in Israel and Oscar in the wondrous life of Oscar Wilde. Second, in both histories, there is a code switching. For instance, in the first history, the author used nouns in Spanish like pinga, chinga, colmado, tigres, and in the second, he used popular sentence that allows the reader not only to situate the history in a Latino context, but also, as these words are considered Dominican slang, they can help us to understand that Junior and Oscar belongs to a low social class. Third, no one has a paternal figure, and the mother worked pretty hard. And the last important element that both stories share is a change in behavior or feelings. In both history, there is a contrast of feelings between joy and adventure contrasted by sadness and loneliness. For example, at the beginning of The Brief Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde, when Oscar was still a child, he loved dancing and he had much confidence in himself. Oscar was something as a Casanova. But the time was passing, and over the years, the body of Oscar was becoming fatter, his face was full of pimples, and as a result, he lost his confidence, and his joints became sadness and loneliness. That pattern is repeated in Israel. If it's true that Junior not suffered physical change, the sadness and loneliness occur in the city, where he is the victim of the bullying that his brother does for the Junior's color skin.
The plot of the Civil Peace story can be understood without knowing much about the author and the context, since the story provides enough data with that purpose. However, by analyzing the story through the New Historicism, it's possible to capture the magnitude and realism of the story. Chinua Achebe was a Nigerian writer who was strongly engaged in the change and religion and culture caused by conflicts. This writer has written different texts about the culture and religion mainly of Africa. Achebe had to live in the specific time and place in which the Nigerian War took place, 1967 to 1970. He survived along with his family, his wife, and 3 children. One of his 4 children died because his wife had an abortion during the escape of a persecution. The story of civil peace is written full of optimism and great emotions that the author had at the time he wrote it. The story was originally published in 1971, which means that the story was published in real time, 1 year after the war. Chinua Achebe had to leave her hometown when the war began. He had to leave everything, including his most precious possession and his house. Unfortunately, when he returned in the post-war period, his house was totally destroyed. Civil Peace is not a story about the Nigerian War. Civil Peace recounts the great experience that had to live Chinua Achebe during the war. The knowledge about the author's experience makes it possible to understand one of the greatest aspects of the story, optimism, which is only a reflection of the author's joy at being alive. The story draws survival as a miracle. However, this cannot really be appreciated if people don't have a knowledge of the Nigerian War. Why is Jonathan grateful because 3 of his 4 children survived with his wife? Why is this reason enough to be optimistic? In the Nigerian War, at least 3 million people from Biafra died during the war. Considering that Biafra had a population of 14 million people, we can say that Jonathan was a lucky person since there was a high probability that more members of his family would die. Another fact that can demonstrate the great luck of Jonathan and his family is that of the 3 million people who died, more than 1 million were children. This was because there was a great famine in the country. An illness called kwashiorkor began to spread in young children. More than 300 girls were kidnapped, and boys were recruited as soldiers. There were plenty of reasons why Jonathan's children might die, but they didn't. Throughout the text, Jonathan alludes to God and related concepts on several occasions. This is not because Jonathan is particularly a very religious person, but because religion is very important in the context. The territory was divided into 2 parts, Nigeria and Biafra. Biafra, the people were Christian, like Jonathan, while in Nigeria there were Muslims. The religious component is so strong that one of the reasons for the war was the existing religious tensions. The story has the phonological features in the dialogues. It can be seen that there is a linguistic distinction in the speech of the thieves and of Jonathan and his family. However, this is not random, but has an explanation. In the year 1900, the British colonized this territory and settled down to the south, in Biafra. So, as the time went by, English language began to expand along the territory to the north. Due to the settlement of the British in the south, the southerners had an English closer to the standard, such as Jonathan and his family, while those from the north still retained phonological and grammatical features, such as the thieves. In addition to the proximity of standard English and social class as variables for the variety of the language, it can also be observed that the people from the south had more time exposed to English and therefore it was close to the standard variety.
The Indian Education short story depicts the Native American education system seen through the eyes of an indigenous child who grows physically and mentally during the school years. This story was written by Chairman Alexi in 2003. Alex's intention of writing this text was to portray how a child receives education within an hostile environment full of discrimination, alienation, and segregation because of ethnicity. If one takes a look at Alexis' biography, one can see his narrative intention to make this story a short biography of his childhood, being a son of Native Americans and living in an American reservation. For telling his story, Alexis organizes his story in 12 sections, from which one corresponds to one of each 12 grades of schooling in the United States. Thanks to that, one can see the evolution of the main character through the years and his experiences. However, marginalization is still there all over the grades. Another interesting narrative feature of the story is the continuous contrast of situations. For example, the main character is happy because he aced an exam, but then he says is overwhelmed for the suicide of one guy of the reservation. These contrasts are repetitive throughout the story. Additionally, the most debatable choice made by the author in his text is the use of italicized sentences. Sometimes there are sentences in italics that want to express a deeper thought of the main character. Sometimes there are other italicized sentences that are in dialogues. In other cases, those sentences reinforce a feeling or a thought, or give more details of a situation. There is no general purpose for the use of these italicized phrases. As it has been highlighted before, thanks to historicism, one can have a deeper understanding of the Indian education short story. Our personal experience reading this text made us realize the importance of knowing about the author because we thought the word Indian in the title was a reference to people from India and not to native people. Because this is somehow an autobiography, using historicism allows us to see how social marginalization happened in the reservations of the USA by the time the author was a child, the 80s. Additionally, it could help us to portray how still being the Native American education system in that country nowadays. Even one can analyze how the conditions in which Native Americans lived that go hand in hand with alienation, physical abuses, and discrimination. Situations that possibly is still happening in the USA. Another distinguished feature of this short story is the absence of code switch. This illustrates how Native American languages might be lost because of the normalization of English as a standard language in the United States. This event might happen because Native Americans have experienced the necessity to communicate to other Americans and not be excluded in that country. With these two principal themes analyzed through new historicism, a particular point of view is produced for generating the impact the author wanted writing this piece. The first person POV depicts both themes as it includes two linguistic features that give more deepness to the story. First, the story portrays the social relations that reflect the marginalization because of ethnicity through lexical choices. Within the same Native Americans, they nickname the main character as Cries Like a White Boy, which illustrates segregation between white people and native people. Also, outsiders discriminate too by calling the main character as an Indian without capitalization. This is particularly curious because one cannot know when someone is speaking with or without capital letters. However, the author put it like that to reinforce this idea of discrimination. Second, the story is characterized by the absence of code switching, as it was said before. This is closely related to the word Englishes, since it is said that English has supremacy over other languages, like the indigenous one, which at the end causes that native groups do not use their local language but the standard ones. All of these themes and linguistic features make particular the short story Indian Education, that with new historicism analysis let us, the readers, portray how the author configures and writes about his identity through a text.
To conclude, new historicism allows the reader to situate each story in their particular context and understand why the author uses certain narrative elements, such as the first person in Israel and Indian education and the third person in the brief, wondrous life of Oscar Wilde and civil peace. Besides, linguistic features of English varieties help the reader to situate geographically the stories. For instance, in United Stories, the use of Dominican slang, in civil peace and Indian education, the phonological and grammatical features.